defence of our liberties and our values. From your regiment's service in Iraq and Afghanistan to your current role here in Poland protecting NATO's eastern flank, you've made those sacrifices in the service of our country. I'm truly humbled by your courage and your professionalism. And on behalf of a proud and grateful nation, let me simply say thank you. But I haven't just brought you here together today to express my gratitude. I want to talk to you about how we equip you to do your duty in an increasingly dangerous world. We've entered a period in history in which competition between countries has sharpened profoundly. An axis of authoritarian states with different values to ours, like Russia, Iran, North Korea and China, are increasingly assertive. The danger they pose is not new. But what is new is that these countries, or their proxies, are causing more instability more quickly in more places at once. And they're increasingly acting together, making common cause in an attempt to reshape the world order. Now, I know there are some people who will think these are faraway problems, but they are not. They pose real risks to the United Kingdom's security and prosperity. Russia has already poisoned people on British soil with chemical weapons, caused energy bills to soar, weaponized migration, and sent technology to Iran in exchange for weapons, like the Shahid drones that I saw myself are wreaking such devastation in Ukraine. Iran themselves have threatened to kill and kidnap people within our borders for exercising their right to free speech, and use proxies, like the Houthis, to attack British ships in the Red Sea, disrupting supplies of crucial goods to our high streets. North Korea, too, is supplying munitions and artillery to Russia, and their hackers have targeted British businesses and the NHS. And Chinese state-affiliated actors have conducted malicious cyber campaigns against British MPs. China itself is engaged in a huge military modernization program. Potential flashpoints in the Indo-Pacific could have an impact on the global economy far larger even than COVID. And China is increasingly working with others to try and reshape the world, including their so-called unlimited partnership with Russia. So the new assertiveness of these authoritarian states far from our shores must concern us, because they are increasingly acting together against the fundamental values that we all hold dear of democracy, freedom, and the rule of law. Now, we must not overstate the danger. We're not on the brink of war, and nor do we seek it. And people should feel reassured that the UK's armed forces are some of the most professional, well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-ready in the world. And I'm incredibly proud of all that they've achieved, from patrolling the Arctic Circle as part of the Joint Expeditionary Force, to the campaign against Daesh in the deserts of Iraq and Syria, from protecting the freedom of navigation in the Red Sea, to policing the skies above Eastern Europe. And just look at the investments we've made in the last decade. £40 billion in the British Army, who proudly provide one of NATO's strategic reserves, with 16,000 troops deployed to Europe this year. The Royal Air Force, equipped with new Typhoons, Chinooks, F-35s, with the GCAP programme delivering new fighter jets with Japan and Italy. The Royal Navy is a carrier navy once again, with 22 new ships and submarines on the way, and the historic AUKUS partnership building the most advanced nuclear-powered subs the world has ever known. And we've launched a new national endeavour to invigorate and invest more in our nuclear deterrent. And all of this is combined with our outstanding diplomatic network, development expertise, law enforcement and intelligence agencies, and support for our allies. Above all, the £12 billion we've provided to Ukraine. So I'm proud of our record on defence and confident in our ability to deter our adversaries and ensure the security of the United Kingdom. But in a world that's the most dangerous it's been since the end of the Cold War, we cannot and must not be complacent. As Churchill said in 1934, to urge the preparation of defence is not to insert the imminence of war. On the contrary, if war was imminent, preparations for defence would be too late. I believe we must do more to defend our country, our interests, and our values. So today I'm announcing the biggest strengthening of our national defence for a generation. We will increase defence spending to a new baseline of 2.5% of GDP by 2030. That starts today and rises steadily in each and every year. Over the next 6 years, we'll invest an additional £75 billion in our defence, and it will be fully funded with no increase in borrowing or debt. So this is not some vague aspiration for the future. We have a clear plan for what we'll spend, when we'll spend it, and how we pay for it. A plan that makes the United Kingdom by far the largest defence power in Europe and second largest in NATO. Today is a landmark moment in the defence of the United Kingdom. This is a generational investment in British security and British prosperity. It makes us safer at home and stronger abroad. Now, we will have 3 immediate priorities for this new investment. First, we will put the UK's own defence industry on a war footing. One of the central lessons of the war in Ukraine is that we need deeper stockpiles of munitions and for industry to be able to replenish them more quickly. So today we're giving £10 billion in munitions support to give industry long-term funding certainty, backed by long-term contracts, so that they can produce more, be readier to surge capacity, and to move to always-on production when required. From surface-to-air missiles made in Bolton to anti-tank weapons in Belfast, we will replenish our stockpiles, all while supporting British jobs right across the Union. But it's not just about investing more, we must invest better. For too long, too much of our defence procurement has been over-complex, over-budget, and over-time. So we are making radical reforms to our procurement model to make sure this new investment delivers value for money. And to encourage private sector investment into defence production, I can also announce today that we're going to put beyond doubt that defence investment does count towards environmental, social, and governance assessments. There is nothing more ethical than defending our way of life from those who threaten it. Now, all of this will put us at the forefront of the global defence industry, allow us to hugely ramp up defence production, and give our armed forces the capability they need to keep us safe. But, as in so many other areas of our lives, technology is changing the face of war. So our second immediate priority is innovation and new technology. We need to innovate and adapt faster than our adversaries in space and cyberspace, just as much as land, sea, and air. Look at Ukraine. Now, many aspects of the war would be familiar to a soldier from World War I or II, yet others would be unimaginably different, like the fact that cheap, high-tech autonomous drones could disable large parts of Russia's Black Sea fleet. Now, the good news is that innovation is already one of our greatest strengths. The UK's own Dragonfire laser directed energy weapon costs only £10 a shot, yet is accurate enough to hit a £1 coin from a kilometre away. And today we're going further. We'll increase our defence R&D at a minimum to 5% of the defence budget, invest far more in autonomous drones, and we will set up a new Defence Innovation Agency so that for the first time, decisions about defence innovation will be brought together in a single strategic agency that will be freed from red tape and work with the private sector on emerging new technologies. Now, third, we must support Ukraine for the long term. Since the Cold War ended, the freedom of our continent has been based on a simple idea, that it is for people to decide the fate of their countries, not foreign armies. But allow Putin to win in Ukraine, and that principle of sovereignty would be undermined. We would be dragged back to a world where brute force, rather than the democratic will of free peoples, would shape borders and decide futures. And Putin will not stop in Ukraine. Win there, and he, and indeed others, will be emboldened. He has the desire, if not yet the capacity, to attack other countries in Europe, potentially including NATO allies, who we would be bound to defend just as they are bound to defend us. The costs of failing to support Ukraine now will be far greater than the costs of repelling Putin, because only if he fails will he and other adversaries be deterred. And that is why the United Kingdom, whose history of standing up to dictators is so much part of our national consciousness, has come together with our allies to stand with Ukraine from the very start. Today we go further. we will send Ukraine an additional £500 million, hitting £3 billion of support this year, and will provide them with the largest ever package of UK military equipment. This will include more than 400 vehicles, 4 million rounds of ammunition, 60 boats and offshore raiding craft, vital air defences, and long-range, precision-guided Storm Shadow missiles. And as we make our historic commitment to increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP, we'll move past this stop-start, piecemeal way of backing Ukraine, so that alongside our long-term security guarantee, we are today providing a long-term funding guarantee of at least the current level of military support to Ukraine for every year it is needed. That is the longest commitment any nation has provided, and it shows that Ukraine is not alone, and Ukraine will never be alone. A decade ago, as Russian tanks rolled into Crimea and the fight against ISIL raged across the Middle East, NATO allies came together in Wales and reached a historic agreement to increase their defence budgets to 2% of GDP. Back then, the UK was one of only 4 countries who did so. Today, there are 11, and I believe we will look back on this moment as a similar turning point in European security. Because for all that we welcome the news over the weekend that the United States Congress agreed a new package of aid for Ukraine, support that will be indispensable on the front line, this is not the moment for complacency. We cannot keep expecting America to pay any price or bear any burden if we ourselves are unwilling to make greater sacrifices for our own security. So I'm proud that the United Kingdom is increasing our defence spending to £87 billion a year, the biggest strengthening of our national defence in a generation, guaranteeing our position as the second largest defence power in NATO after the US. All across Europe, countries like Poland, Germany, Norway, and the Baltic nations are stepping up to take greater responsibility for our own security. And I'm confident that whether in months or years, others will follow too. And at this turning point in European security, if 2.5% becomes a new benchmark for all NATO partners to reach, Allied defence spending would increase by over £140 billion. That would provide a level of safety and security for the British people and the people of all Allied nations that far outstrips anything we could achieve alone. To conclude, we did not choose this moment, but it falls to us to meet it. In a world of increasing threats, we must show our enemies that we are resolute and determined, that their attempts to destabilise our world or redraw its borders by force will fail, that with our friends and our allies, we will be at the forefront of the defence of the free democratic world. And under my leadership, the United Kingdom will always stand up for our interests, deter our enemies, and defend our values. Now it's my enormous pleasure to introduce Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary-General. Jens, thank you for joining us today. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Prime Minister Sunak and Stoltenberg. It's great to be here in Poland together with you today. The United Kingdom is a highly valued and staunch and essential NATO ally, contributing greatly to our shared security in so many different ways. You lead NATO forces in Estonia. British jets help guard the skies over our eastern flank. The Royal Navy helps keep critical sea lanes open. The United Kingdom is also at the centre of the exercise Steadfast Defender, currently underway and involving more than 16,000 British military personnel. And we are today here in Poland with British troops, a physical embodiment of your commitment to NATO. So thank you to all of you. Prime Minister, your announcement today confirms the vital role the UK plays in our alliance. The United Kingdom will spend 2.5% of GDP on defence by 2030. Allies agreed at our summit in Vilnius last year that 2% is a minimum. And once again, the UK is leading by example. Just as you did in 2014, after the illegal annexation of Crimea, when you were one of the first allies to provide training and military support to Ukraine. And after the full-scale invasion in 2022, you stepped up significantly, training thousands of Ukrainian soldiers and providing billions of pounds of military assistance. And today, your announcement of additional support, including more ammunition, air defence and deep precision strike capabilities, shows once again the British people's commitment to Ukraine. I welcome your cast iron commitment to continue these levels of support to Ukraine for as long as needed. In NATO, we are now addressing how to put our support for Ukraine on a more robust and predictable footing, including with a multi-year financial commitment. So, Prime Minister, your commitment sets us on the right direction. I also welcome that other allies are taking action, not least Poland, which provides key capabilities to Ukraine and hosts 1 million Ukrainian refugees. Over the weekend, the US House of Representatives approved a major aid package for Ukraine. This will enable the US to provide substantial additional support to Ukraine quickly. And last Friday, NATO defense ministers agreed to further bolster Ukraine's air defenses. Germany's delivery of another Patriot system is imminent, and other allies made concrete commitments in that NATO meeting, with deliveries expected soon. Faced with the biggest conflict on the European continent since the Second World War, our decisions today will have consequences for generations to come. We must not falter. We live in a more dangerous world. Authoritarian powers are increasingly aligned. Russia is receiving support for its war of aggression from China, Iran and North Korea. This reminds us that security is not regional, security is global, and we must work with our like-minded partners around the world to preserve and protect transatlantic security. NATO is a defensive alliance. We do not seek conflict with Russia, but we will keep our 1 billion people safe. The 10,000 NATO troops based here in Poland send an unmistakable message that NATO will protect and defend all allies. So, Prime Minister Sunak, thank you again for UK's vital contributions to NATO. Thank you.
Jens, thank you very much. Can we take some questions from the media? If we start with ITV, please.
Prime Minister, ever since the Cold War ended, we've enjoyed what was known as the peace dividend that allowed more money to be spent on schools, welfare, hospitals. Are those days definitively over, and must those other areas take a hit as a result?
Well, thank you for the question. I wouldn't characterise it in exactly that way, because thanks to our management of the economy, we're able to make this announcement today. The bedrock of everything we want to achieve as a country is found on having a strong economy. Now, when I came into office, inflation was running at 11%, energy bills had skyrocketed. We're in a far better place today. Inflation back down at 3% and falling, energy bills falling, interest rates to follow, and the economy is growing again. So I think it's because of that strong management of the economy that I can stand here today and make this announcement. But what I would say is we do have to recognise that we live in a more dangerous world. It's a more dangerous international environment than at probably any time since the end of the Cold War. I think the Secretary-General and I would agree on that. And as he ended and I started with, what we are seeing are authoritarian states around the world acting in a way that is increasingly connected, and that is threatening to our interests, undermining of our values, and damaging to our allies. And in that environment, the right thing for me to do, in fact, my duty and obligation as a British Prime Minister, is to make sure that we are strengthening our national defence so I can keep our country safe. And that's what this announcement reflects. It reflects the fact that the world is sadly a more dangerous and uncertain place. And in that environment, the UK will do what it's always done, lead by example, as the Secretary-General said, invest in our national defence so that we can keep our country safe, and together with our friends and allies around the world, defend the values that we all hold so dear and that colleagues in this room and generations before them have fought very hard to defend. And as I said, of course that comes with choices. Government is about choices. But my belief is that it's the right choice for the country at this moment to invest more and strengthen our national defence. To do otherwise would be to abrogate my responsibility as Prime Minister. And I said, under my leadership, that's not what we're going to do. We're going to invest more in our national defence to keep our country safe and our alliances strong. Next, can we turn to the Daily Mail?
Thanks, PM. The sort of crisis in the Middle East has kind of taken the spotlight a little bit off Ukraine. You mentioned NATO's Article 5. Just to be clear, you're ready to take Britain to war if Russian troops set one boot in this country or any other NATO ally. Is that right? And Mr. Stoltenberg, can I ask you, you had a pretty bumpy time with Donald Trump last time round. What do you feel about working with him again?
If I take the first one, Jason, look, our commitment to NATO is absolutely unequivocal, and as Jens will speak to, the UK has proudly contributed to every NATO mission, and Jens can talk to you about the importance of the UK and our armed forces to the overall NATO security umbrella. Something we're proud to play our part in, and contributes massively to the UK's own security. It's a cornerstone of our own defence, is the fact that we have a nuclear deterrent and we're a member of the greatest defensive military alliance that the world has ever seen. But when it comes to you said, we're here and talking about the situation, I wanted to come and make this announcement here and together with Jens, because you're right, yes, there has been a lot of focus on the Middle East, rightly, in the past few weeks and months, but we can't lose sight of the situation here in Europe, on our continent, with Russian aggression. And I think that's why it's important for us to be able to make this announcement here. And we spoke with Donald earlier, and I'll be seeing him later today. Security is indivisible, and our job is to stand with our allies. And if Putin is not deterred here, then that will cost us far more at home down the line, whether it's with him or whether it's other adversaries around the world who are watching. So the right thing to do is to invest now in our deterrence and make sure that he's not successful, because the cost of not doing that will be far greater to our own security and prosperity at home later on.
Before I answer the question, let me just express my deepest condolences to the loved ones of the Spanish corporal who died here in Poland during NATO's Sabre Strike exercise. I express my condolences to the Spanish government. I'm in touch with the Spanish authorities, and we owe him and all NATO's men and women in uniform our eternal gratitude. Then to the question. A strong NATO is good for Europe, but a strong NATO is also good for the United States. And I expect that regardless of the outcome of the elections in the US later this year, the US will remain a staunch and loyal ally, at least for three reasons. It is in the security of the interest of the United States to have NATO and to have more than 30 friends and allies. That makes also the United States stronger and safer. The United States is a big ally. They represent 25% of the world's GDP. But together with all NATO allies together, we represent 50%, twice as much of the world's GDP. And together we represent 50% of the world's military might. So NATO is making the US safer and stronger. It is in the interest of the United States to keep NATO, and therefore I believe they will remain a staunch and loyal ally. Second, it is broad bipartisan support for NATO in the United States, in the US Congress and in the US public, if you look at the results from the opinion polls. And thirdly, the criticism we have heard from the United States, not only from former Prime Minister Donald Trump, but also from others, former President Donald Trump, but also from others, is that is that it has not primarily been a criticism against NATO allies. It has been a criticism against NATO allies not spending enough on NATO. And that it's changing. When we made the defence investment pledge, the pledge to defence more, back at the NATO summit in Cardiff in Wales in 2014, only 3 allies spent 2% or more on defence. This year, I expect 2/3, 20 or perhaps even more allies to spend 2% of GDP on defence. And then you have allies like the United Kingdom, spending not 2% but 2.5%, committing to spend 2.5% of GDP, and by far the biggest defence investor among the European allies, and with clear margin the biggest defence budget in the alliance after the United States, and contributing in so many different ways to different NATO missions and operations. So I think that European allies, again, not least with the example of the United Kingdom, are demonstrating to the United States that we do this together, and the United States know that they have never been at war since the Second World War without allies, from the Korean War to the war in Afghanistan. So for these reasons, I am confident that yes, there may be discussions, there may be differences on some issues, but fundamentally the United States, Europe and North America will stand together also after the US elections.
Excellent. Thank you, Jens. Can I go next to The Guardian?
Thank you. Pippa Carrera from The Guardian. Prime Minister, if I could start off with if I could ask you a domestic question, if I may. Thousands of people who care for their loved ones have been hounded by the DWP for thousands of pounds, and in some cases even convicted. You may have read about the cases, after unwittingly breaching earnings rules by just a few pounds a week. Several former Secretaries of State, including Ian Duncan-Smith, have described it as a scandal. Do you agree with them? Is this yet another symptom of the broken care system? And would you set up an inquiry? And if I could ask a question to Mr Stoltenberg as well, please. You may have seen, but all the polls in the UK suggest that we may end up having a different government after the election. How reassured are you by this really important defence commitment given by Mr Sunak if he then ends up finding himself out of office later this year? And have you had discussions, because of that, taking the precautionary principle with the British opposition? Thank you.
Pippa, if I might start on the issue, I'm obviously not familiar with the individual cases, but there has been some reporting around carers' allowance and how it works. Now, it's been a long-standing principle in the way that carers' allowance works, which is not means tested, but is subject to an earnings threshold, that people are asked to declare their earnings at the time that they're making those claims, and those are later verified. Now, without getting to the details of anyone's individual claim, that's been a long-standing practice where people, as I said, have to declare their earnings. Those are later checked where later on down the line by DWP, and if there's a discrepancy that impacts people's entitlement, then obviously they will seek to recover that and do that in a sensible, fair way, making sure that there's a repayment plan in place if people have not declared their earnings accurately in the first place. Everyone's individual case will be different, so it's hard for me to get into that, but I think it's reasonable that the welfare system is fair. Of course, we want a compassionate safety net, and I was talking about this last week. We want a welfare system that is there for people who genuinely need it. We also need to make sure it's fair to everyone who's paying into it, and that's why last week, I outlined a significant set of reforms to the welfare system overall to tackle what we're seeing, which is a significant increase in claims and bills, spending on ill health and disability benefits, as I said, forecast to be around £69 billion. I mean, that is an extraordinary amount of money. We're talking about defence spending here today. That's more than we're spending on things like schools, on policing, transport budget. So it gives you a sense of the scale. The PIP budget alone is forecast to increase 50% in the next 4 years unless we do something differently. And that's why the reforms that we've outlined last week will ensure that the welfare system remains compassionate, there for those who need it, but it's not exploited or gamed, and we can target resources on those who most need it, and crucially recognise that work is good for people. I'm someone who believes that hard work is how you grow and build a country. It gives you purpose in life, and that's why we should have a system that supports people into work, because that is largely in their interests. And look, with regard, I'll let Jens talk. I'm probably not right to draw Jens into domestic politics, actually, given that wouldn't be appropriate for him. But what I would say is that we're very clear that this is a choice that we've made, a choice that I've made. We talked a little bit about it earlier. But what I would say is that when the general election comes, there will be a choice on this topic. And Keir Starmer is someone who not once but twice asked the British people to make Jeremy Corbyn Prime Minister. Jeremy Corbyn wanted to leave NATO, get rid of our nuclear deterrent and turn the army into the Peace Corps. Right? And currently, as we speak, multiple members of the Labour senior team voted against Trident, voted against our nuclear deterrent, including the shadow leader, the shadow foreign secretary. Right? So that's the choice at the next election. I think this is the most dangerous time since the end of the Cold War, and in order to keep people at home safe, support our allies and alliances around the world, I think the right thing to do is to increase our defence spending. I'm proud that our party, as Jens said, back in 2014 was one of a few countries to make sure we met the NATO 2% commitment, and that wasn't easy, because if you remember, back in 2010, the Conservatives inherited a country where Labour had bankrupted the public finances, and in spite of that, we decided to prioritise defence spending because that was the right thing to do. That was the right thing to do then. The right thing to do today is increase it to 2.5%. That's what you get with us. We're consistent about this and people know where we stand. I think that choice will be very clear come the election. Next, if we go to the Telegraph.
Thank you, Prime Minister. You had some very strong words about the threat from China at the start of your speech, and you link those directly to this extra money that you're putting into defence and protecting Britain. Is it now time, as a lot of your MPs want, to designate China officially as a threat, and will you put it on the enhanced tier list of countries? Mr Stoltenberg, you mentioned Patriot's defence systems. At a meeting yesterday, European defence ministers fell short of signing off on sending those to Ukraine. Will you use this announcement by the UK to put pressure on those European countries who are still holding out on weapon supplies? Thank you.
Yeah. Look, I think we've been consistently clear, I've been consistently clear that China is a country with different values to ours. It's behaving in a way that is more authoritarian at home, more assertive overseas, and it's right that we protect ourselves against that. Now, I wouldn't reduce, I think, complex foreign policy down to one word or phrase, but what I am confident about is that we're taking practical steps that keep us safe. We passed the National Security Investment Act, for example, and we've used it to block Chinese investment in sensitive technology sectors like semiconductors, Newport wafer fab. We removed Chinese telecoms equipment from our network. We made sure that the Chinese state nuclear entity is not going to be part of our future nuclear plans, and we last year passed the National Security Act, which I won't get into on first designations, but as you know, gives us a range of tools and powers that we need to keep our country safe from state threats. So look, that's been our consistent approach to China, robust and tough to protect ourselves, but of course, recognising the fact that China is an indisputable part of the global economy. So whether it's on things like AI, climate change, public health, it's important that we maintain a dialogue and find common ground. But at the same time, as I said, recognise and protect ourselves against the risks and threats that it poses. And as Jens alluded to in his remarks, and as did I, we are seeing an interconnectedness, and Jens can probably expand on that, between China and some of these other authoritarian states around the world, whether it's on sanctions evasion, the supply of arms or components, and it's probably worth Jens touching on that. And we have to recognise that. That's the world that we live in. Our integrated review absolutely anticipated that. It talked about the growing insecurity coming from state-based threats. It exactly recognise this, but they are happening at a quicker pace and in a more interconnected fashion. And as Jens said, our security is indivisible wherever it might be threatened around the world.
So first on air defence, of course I welcome the announcement from the United Kingdom from Rishi here today for many reasons, but not least because it also makes it possible to deliver more air defence from the United Kingdom to Ukraine. That is urgently needed, and I welcome the announcement also for that reason. Then we are working in NATO actively with NATO allies to provide even more. And in particular, the different types of Patriot systems We had a meeting on Friday, last Friday, NATO defense ministers, together with President Zelensky and Prime Minister Umrov, and allies agree that we need to do more. We have the German announcement of another Patriot battery. Other allies also made clear commitments. I expect them to announce that in the near future. Then, of course, we also have the US decision in the US House of Representatives that will also enable more delivery of advanced air defense systems to Ukraine. And then we also have to remember that the F-16s, where allies now are training pilots and delivering F-16s, will also significantly strengthen the air defense of Ukraine. So we are working on this, and we also, as we prepare for the NATO summit, looking for a more robust and predictable framework for more long-term support to Ukraine that also will enable more delivery of air defense. Then briefly on China. So China, or the war in Ukraine, demonstrates how intertwined, how interlinked our security is. Because China is propping up the Russian war economy. Iran is delivering drones and ammunition to Russia. North Korea is delivering ammunition to Russia. And in return, Moscow is mortgaging its future to Beijing, and Moscow is delivering technology to North Korea and Iran to help them develop their missile and nuclear programs. So this is really a demonstration of how what happens in Asia matters for Europe, and what happens in Europe matters for Asia. And that's the reason why also we are now stepping up our cooperation with our partners in the region, South Korea, Japan, New Zealand and Australia, just to make sure that we are working closely with them.
Yeah. Thanks, Jens. Go to the BBC next.
Thank you. Chris Mason, BBC News. A question to both of you, if I may. Is it time to be candid now with people that the costs of supporting Ukraine are going to run into the billions and billions for years and years to come? Could this last another decade? And Prime Minister, if I may, I wonder what your reaction is to the news today of the deaths in the English Channel. Thank you.
Well, Chris, as I touched on, unfortunately, we're living in a more dangerous time than at any point since the end of the Cold War. And what we're seeing is an axis of authoritarian states, including, as Jens was talking about, China, North Korea, Iran, Russia, undermining our values and increasingly working together. And in response to that, the right thing to do is to invest more in our national defence. And that's why we're going to go to 2.5% of GDP by 2030, starting today and steadily increasing. Ukraine is important because an investment in Ukraine is an investment in our security. If we don't deter Russia in Ukraine, all we're going to do is embolden Putin to go even further, and indeed embolden other adversaries around the world to do the same. And that will end up not just costing us more in the long term, but undermining the world order that we've spent decades building, proudly from the UK and together with NATO. So that's why I think it is right to make this announcement, to make this investment, and supporting Ukraine ultimately will enhance our own security. These aren't things that are happening far away. You know, what happened in Ukraine with Russia ended up meaning that everyone in the UK's energy bills spiraled, more than doubled. It would have quadrupled if it wasn't for government intervention. What's happening now in the Red Sea will impact shipping lanes and the cost of goods that end up in our high street shops. You know, these things have an impact on us here at home. And by making this investment, whether it's supporting our Ukrainian friends, whether it's in new technology or munitions, all of which contributes to future UK security and prosperity. That's why it's the right thing to do. And I wanted to be honest with people, though, about the environment we're in and the necessity of making this choice at this moment to meet it. As I said, we didn't choose this moment, but it falls to us to meet it. And I believe that today's decision means that we'll be well prepared for the future and we'll keep the country safe. And I'll let Jens come on to that same point in a second. But to touch on your second question, incredibly sad to hear about the deaths in the Channel. And it just underscores how important it is that we stop these criminal gangs who are exploiting incredibly vulnerable people, making these illegal crossings across the Channel, and as we have heard today, many more perishing as they make those dangerous journeys. And that's why, as a matter of basic compassion, I want to stop the boats. Right? Yes, of course, it puts pressure on public services. Yes, of course, it's costing us a fortune accommodating illegal migrants in hotels around the country. And yes, of course, it's unfair, and it undermines our British notion of fairness, that people are jumping the queue. But fundamentally, it is deeply dangerous, and there's nothing compassionate about allowing the current system to continue. That's what I believe, and that's why I'm determined to do everything I can to stop the boats. That's why we've worked very hard to get our Rwanda bill through Parliament, as I'm pleased we did very late last night, in spite of the Labour opposition. And once we get the deterrent up and running, this will help us stop the boats. People need to know that if they come to our country illegally, they won't be able to stay. We will be able to remove them. And when we can demonstrate that deterrent, we will see the numbers come down and, crucially, save people's lives in the process. And that is above and beyond all why I'm so determined to see this through. Jens, do you want to answer the first question?
Yeah. On the cost of the support to Ukraine, I think you have to remember that it has a cost to have Russia as a neighbour. It has a cost to ensure that Ukraine prevails. There is no way we can run away from that cost. We have to pay. Not least because we need to understand that the most expensive alternative is to allow Putin to win in Ukraine. Because then we will actually live in a much more dangerous world. Then our security will really be challenged. And then we have to invest significantly more in our defence compared to the support we now deliver to Ukraine. So the reality is that it has a cost to have an aggressive neighbour, and we have a very aggressive neighbour. There's no way you can run away from that cost. We can only invest now in Ukraine's security. That's good for them, it's good for us, and it actually reduces the overall cost of coping with Russia as a neighbour. If we allow Putin to win, then the cost will go up, not down. And second, we have to remember that even though we now, all allies, we are providing unprecedented, significant support to Ukraine, it's only a fraction of defence budgets. We speak about 2%. This is less than 0.2% of our defence, or our GDP. So, and we have no NATO soldiers in harm's way, no British, no Norwegian, no NATO soldiers at all. So by providing support to Ukraine, we help them to destroy Russian combat capabilities that could potentially be a threat against us. Support to Ukraine is not charity. Support to Ukraine is an investment in our own security, and the alternative is more expensive.
The only thing I'd just add on that point, Chris, is, I think you have to recognise that the defence industry in the UK also employs hundreds of thousands of people. And part of what we work very hard with Grant and CDS to do is ensure that this new investment is going to benefit British companies and support British jobs. And the munitions strategy that Grant will be outlining, the long-term contracts that we'll put in place to increase supply of a whole range of munitions, artillery and equipment, benefit companies and jobs all around the UK. MDBA in Bolton, Thales in Belfast, just to give you a couple of examples. In the document that we've published today, you'll see a map of where that defence investment is spread, and it really is a full United Kingdom endeavour. And one of the reasons that we want to get this investment right and do it over the long term is that we can build up the UK defence supply chain. And what Ukraine illustrated is we need a more resilient supply chain that can produce more quickly. And that's why, as I said, this investment is not just good for our security, it's good for British jobs at home and across the Union as well. Can I turn next to Sky?
Thank you, Prime Minister. Beth Rigby, Sky News. A question for you both, please. You talk about Europe being at a turning point and this spending putting the UK on a war footing. Have we entered a pre-war era? And you also talk about an axis of authoritarian states working together. We have long known of their hostility. Has something changed suddenly that is particularly concerning you? Thank you.
No, Beth, thanks for both of those questions. I think, look, people will call this different words, and I quoted Churchill earlier. I think we have to recognise that the world, as I said, is in a more dangerous place than it's been since the end of the Cold War. Now, this is not something new. As our integrated review in 2021 and the refresh anticipated this. It talked exactly about the increasing competition from state-based threats and identified all these things. But as I said in my statement, what is new is, I think, the pace and intensity of where we're seeing these threats emerge. And actually, I commend to everyone CDS's excellent Chatham House speech, which talked about this as well. So that's what we're seeing that has changed, is that pace and intensity, and as Jens has highlighted, the interconnectedness where you've got these states working together, supporting each other, and that's what we have to recognise has changed. And that's why it's important that we make this investment and make this investment now. And I believe it's the right thing to do. And then what was your second question was? Yeah, I think that is the main thing. But the one thing I also would just point out, because we've been talking a lot about it, is that we should approach this question from a position of strength and confidence. Right, and I think Ukraine is a good example of that. If you think back a couple of years, I think Jens will probably echo this as well. This special operation that Russia undertook was meant to be over in a matter of weeks. Right? Ukraine was meant to be subjugated, and everyone was meant to go home. And if you take a step back, I think Putin has absolutely failed in all of his big strategic objectives. And you can see that in lots of different ways, but half the land that Russia initially took has been recaptured by the Ukrainians. Incredible bravery. If you look at what's happening to Russian armoured vehicles, they've had literally thousands and thousands that have been lost, which will take them years to recover that capability. If you look at what's happening in the Black Sea most recently, actually this is a country that didn't have a functioning navy properly, which has essentially taken out 25% of vessels in the Black Sea, and now is exporting more grain through the Black Sea than it did through the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and pretty much back to pre-war levels. And more strategically, as Jens can speak to, allies are united, defence spending is growing across Europe, and NATO has 2 new members. Right, so if you take a step back, Russia has not in any way succeeded, and actually on any one of these measures, it's been a huge strategic failure for Russia. I mean, if you talk, there's a lot about the geography and the territorial gains, places like Bakhmut, Avdiivka, but just to put it in context, right, those 2 places that, yes, Russia has made some progress in geographically, to give you a sense of scale, one of them is about the size of Basildon, and one of them is about the size of Eastbourne. Right? So that is the sum total of the Russian gains over the past, Tony, probably almost 9 months of fighting, and that has come at a cost of tens of thousands of injuries or Russian soldiers who have lost their lives. Right? So I just, yes, are there more threats? There are. We should approach this situation from a position of strength and confidence, because we have been making the right investments. NATO is strong, our alliance is strong, people are doing the right thing. And so, on any of those objectives, Russia has not succeeded. But we can't be complacent, and that's why the announcement today, and Jens, I'm sure you have anything else to add.
Just briefly on this issue, whether we live in a pre-war period. Well, we live in a more dangerous world, and we see that Russia is willing to use military force against a neighbor, Ukraine, to achieve their goals. At the same time, I think we need to remember that NATO is there with one core purpose, and that is to prevent war, preserve peace. That's why NATO is established. That's why we exist. And NATO has successfully been able to prevent any armed attack against any NATO ally for 75 years. Even during the coldest and most difficult period of the Cold War, we preserved peace. And our aim is to continue to do so. And I'm absolutely confident that we will be able to do that as long as we stand together, North America and Europe. And we have allies like the United Kingdom, which is now investing more and taking this seriously. So that also applies for those authoritarian powers, which are now coming more and more closely aligned. Of course, we take that seriously. That's why we address it in NATO. That's why we are investing more, why we're working with our Asia-Pacific partners. But again, just NATO allies, we are 50% of the world's military power. We are by far the strongest military power in the world, and if you then add our partners, Japan, South Korea and others, which are very much together with us in addressing these challenges, we are safe as long as we stand together. I cannot tell you exactly what the next crisis or the next war will be, but what I can tell you is that if we stand together, we will be able to protect and preserve peace for NATO allies.
I know we're up against the clock a bit, so I'll try and rattle through a couple more. Can we go to GB News, please?
Thank you. Secretary General, you've said that we can't expect America to always bear the burden and pay up. And although Donald Trump put it very bluntly, he is right, isn't he, that Poland is paying their way, you know, Britain is, but there's many members of NATO not paying 2%. How do you get them actually to pay their fair share? And also, Prime Minister, lots of brave servicemen and women here today, but there is a crisis in recruitment of the military, isn't there? How do you counter that? How do you encourage people to realise that this is a career worth having? Thank you.
Yes,
Yeah. So first of all, several US presidents have called for more defence spending from NATO allies in Europe and Canada. We have beautiful quotes from John F. Kennedy asking European allies to spend more. And it was actually President Biden who was the President of the United States when we were in Wales at the Cardiff summit and agreed to spend more as allies together at that summit. Then, of course, President Trump also expressed this very strongly to NATO allies, as President Biden has done. So this has been a consistent US message, actually also a UK message, that those allies who are spending less than 2% should spend more. And the good news is that we, over the last years, have had a significant increase. I will give you final numbers in July ahead of the NATO summit, but I expect it will be two-thirds of allies will be at 2%, which is not all, but significantly better than just a few years ago. And I expect those allies who are not yet at 2%, first of all, they have moved closer to 2%. Every ally has increased, or have increased, and I expect that those allies who are not yet at 2% will have clear plans in place to be there very soon. So therefore, we have much fairer burden sharing among NATO allies now than just had a few years ago.
Perfect. Thanks, Jens. And the UK is doing our part, as the Secretary General said, leading by example. And I think it's right that we demonstrate to our American friends that we are prepared to make those sacrifices and invest in our own security. And as we did in 2014, the UK has again stepped up, led by example, to help galvanise others to do the same and ensure continued American support for our security as well. I'm very privileged. My Member of Parliament, my constituency is in North Yorkshire, and I have the great privilege of representing Catterick Garrison, which is our largest army base, be familiar to some of you, but also RAF Leeming. So for some years, I've had the enormous privilege of representing everyone here's colleagues, maybe some of you, and in this job, I have the enormous privilege of representing all our armed forces and talking to them, and we're very lucky. As Jens will attest to, everywhere I go, I hear nothing but praise for the professionalism of our armed forces. They are the people that everyone wants to work with. They're incredibly grateful and excited when they're on joint exercises with all of you. That's something that I'm sure Jens will attest to with all our NATO partners. When I spent the night on HMS Diamonds, one of our frigate destroyers some time ago, they'd just been on a NATO exercise in the High North, and again, the colleagues there all talking so positively about what you bring to the table, and it gives me enormous pride to be your Prime Minister. But it's important that we continue to support you. And it's about pay and making sure you're paid properly, but also it's about making sure that the accommodation that you and your families live in is fit for standard. And I acknowledge that that hasn't always been the case, and I'm sorry about that, and we all know the reasons why that is. But what I can absolutely assure you is that Defence Secretary, me, the Chancellor of CDS, are determined to put that right. And I'm pleased we're investing, I think, something like £4 billion over the next decade to improve accommodation back home and around the world. I think we're currently at about 97% of accommodation that meets the standard that we would expect, but of course we need to get to 100%, and that's what we're doing. And we're making sure that you get all the other support you need during your careers to retain staff. We had the Haythornthwaite review, which we're in the process of responding to, which have lots of practical suggestions for us. But what I am pleased about is, I think in January, the last set of numbers that we've had the highest number of applications to join the Army that we've had in about 6 or 7 years. So hopefully the things that we are doing are right. We need to make sure we give you all the support you need, because we're very lucky to have your service. Just the other week I was hosting an event for veterans. And it's really important to me as Prime Minister that the UK is the best country in the world to be a veteran. So it's not just supporting you while you're in service, it's supporting you when you leave as well. And one of the points I was making at that event is you're an enormous asset. Often when we talk about Veterans Affairs, we talk about the support that veterans need, whether it's with mental health, physical health, housing. And Johnny Mercer, the Veterans Minister, and I were there actually announcing a new program on employment and making companies realise that the best business decision that they could make is to hire one of you when you leave the armed forces, because you bring an incredible amount of skills, of resilience, of experience to bear, and we need to make sure that that national asset is recognised by all our companies and that we can support you into fantastic careers if you choose to leave the forces at some point as well. So I care about this very personally. I said I've seen it firsthand being an MP for many years in a military area. It's an enormous privilege to be your Prime Minister, and I'm determined to make sure you guys get all the support that you need from us. Right, very briefly, and then we better wrap up. Can I go to the Sun quickly, and then Daria as well?
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. On your announcement today, what do you say to critics who will recall you resisting calls for the 2.5% pledge, pledged by Boris Johnson in 2022, and will now inevitably think that you're doing it in an election year? And to you and the Secretary-General, there have been reports today that Germany isn't happy with the level of defence spending by the UK. Is that a fair criticism from a country which until recently have been seeming to be slacking in its NATO commitments?
I think, actually, I'm looking forward to seeing Olaf tomorrow, and I'm sure Jens would agree with me. Germany and the UK are the two largest defence spenders in Europe and are the two countries which have been at the forefront of providing support to Ukraine, and I'm confident that that will continue, and we're actually in the process of strengthening our defence and security cooperation with the Germans, and I'm looking forward to having good conversations on that tomorrow. And there's also good collaboration between our defence industrial bases as well, which again I'll be speaking a little bit about tomorrow. So I think actually that cooperation has been very strong, and I pay tribute to Chancellor Scholz, to Olaf for the Zeitenwende, which is a significant increase in investment in security, a big change in German policy. I think he deserves enormous praise for the leadership he's shown on that issue. And as I said, I think we have a very good, positive relationship. And look, with regard to my approach to these things, you talked about 2021 and all that. I was a Chancellor who oversaw the largest increase in the defence budget since the end of the Cold War, £24 billion. And at every budget fiscal event that we've had since I've been Prime Minister, we've continued to invest more in our defence, crucially in rebuilding stockpiles as we were going through the Ukraine war, but then crucially also strengthening our nuclear deterrence, investing more in that, not just on the armed forces side, but also in Barrow, to make sure that Barrow can handle all the growth that we need from it in the coming years and decades, but also building partnerships around the world, whether it's GCAP to build the next generation of our fighter jets, or AUKUS, which is a truly historic agreement between Australia, America and ourselves to build the most advanced nuclear-powered submarines that the world has ever seen. So look, that's my record on those things. And when it comes to Ukraine, as Jens will attest to, because he and I have worked together for the last year and a half, I have been at the forefront of making those decisions to get Ukraine more support. And that whether that's being the first country to do main battle tanks, the first country to say that we would train aircraft pilots, and crucially the first country to provide long-range weapons, Storm Shadow, which have been an enormous success in Ukraine. Again, it was me and it was the UK that made those decisions ahead of everyone else, working closely with Jens, and we've done that for the last year and a half. So this is something that I've always taken incredibly seriously, but this is the right moment to make this announcement for the reasons that I've outlined.
Just to briefly add to that, the United Kingdom has been leading by example, both when it comes to defence spending within the alliance and when it comes to providing support to Ukraine. I welcome, of course, the significant announcement today of spending 2.5% of GDP on defence. That will make a difference. It will demonstrate the United Kingdom's leading role in the alliance, and it would add to the many capabilities you are already providing to our shared security, to our collective defence. And then I, of course, also welcome the fact that Germany has now also started to really step up and are spending, or Germany is spending 2% of GDP on defence this year. In totality, that makes a huge difference because As Richie said, the UK is the biggest European defence spender, and then Germany the second largest. So together, this is really big money that matters for the alliance. And then on Ukraine, first on main battle tanks, first on deep precision strike, and actually first on training Ukrainian soldiers, and first on training pilots. So this is a huge difference, and that's the reason also why the UK really is a staunch and highly valued NATO ally.
Perfect. And lastly, if we just go to the Polish media, Daria El-Shahabi.
I'm not Daria, but I'm Karol Kostrzewa, Polish Press Agency. I would like to ask, are there any talks in NATO countries about expanding the nuclear sharing program? Thank you very much.
Spending. I didn't get the program.
Nuclear sharing program.
Oh, sorry, so expanding. No, there are no plans to expand the NATO sharing arrangements. No plans to deploy any more nuclear weapons in any additional NATO countries.
Perfect. Thank you all very much for your time. I look forward to meeting some of you in a little bit. Come on,
yes, thank you.